Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, I'll be talking about my thoughts on Metro Exodus 1 year after the game's initial release. And this is also around the 1 year anniversary of when I originally played the first two games in the Metro series. And I did a review of that on my channel a year ago, so why not talk about Metro Exodus now? So essentially, here are my really late thoughts on the third game in the Metro series. I really enjoyed my experience with the first two games in the series, and that caused me to have really high expectations for Exodus. But when Exodus came out, I just felt very underwhelmed. What I really loved from the first two Metro games was that it was a narrative-focused first-person shooter, which, the FPS genre as a whole is something I've never particularly cared for. But for games like Metro and BioShock, I'm willing to overlook my issues with the genre and enjoy those games for their narratives. But for me, Metro Exodus just felt like it took the Metro series and mixed it in with a very generic open world shooter. And I got a lot more like Far Cry vibes from this game, and that's not what I wanted from a Metro game. Now, I'm not saying this is a bad game, I'm just saying it isn't exactly what I wanted. So let's talk about the gameplay, which for the most part is similar to the previous Metro games. It's a first-person shooter with survival horror elements. The gas mask system returns here, though it isn't utilized nearly as much as in the previous games, as not everywhere on the surface requires it in this game. And while playing this game, I never really had an issue with filters, which is something I had a lot of issues with in Metro 2033. And that was actually one of my major complaints with that game. Though I will say I did play this game on easy, so that's obviously probably a major factor there. But another reason for it is that you now have the ability to craft anywhere, and while the things that you can craft is limited compared to what you could do at a workbench, filters and med kits are things that you can craft at any point, which is something that did make this system a little bit less frustrating. But this crafting system does completely replace the shops and currency system that was in place for the first two games. I didn't really spend that much time upgrading my weapons in this game. A lot of that came from me just finding upgraded weapons all the time from just looting enemies. But again, I don't know if that's because I played on easy or what, but for me it was just super easy to find like fully upgraded weapons all the time. And speaking of looting, the open world aspect of this game along with the crafting system makes looting really important in this game, where you have to find materials to craft really basic supplies like med kits and filters, as I mentioned earlier, which are very rare to find in the actual open world. Though you could also craft things like ammo, and you can clean your weapons with these materials as well. I did find that this game had a lot more focus on stealth, and to be fair, I mostly ignored it. I just ran into combat, which is another factor of me, again, playing on easy, but I just find that the most fun way to play this game. But there is one chapter in the taiga where you do spend the entire time on your own, and you could tell that the game wants you to play it in a very stealthy fashion. But again, I really just didn't have the patience for it. The type of weapons in this game are mostly the same from the previous games, but I did find myself using things like throwing knives and Molotov cocktails a bit more often than I normally would, with the Molotovs actually being very helpful during the boss battles in the game. As I mentioned before, a good chunk of this game's chapters comprise of individual open worlds, unlike the previous games, which had a very linear style of gameplay outside of the camps and underground cities. And through this, you spend a good chunk of time on the surface, which was the most terrifying part of the original games, as you always had fears of like mutants attacking you or you running out of filters. But in this game, it's the complete opposite, where the underground sections were filled with mutant spiders and mostly required the use of filters, and even sometimes I got lost, and it just really wasn't a fun section in this game. The open worlds, though, are pretty big, to the point where they added vehicles to the games, like boats and cars, and they didn't control great. I really didn't like using them. Driving the cars and everything felt very loose. Driving the boat was very clunky, as it would get stuck on almost everything. It was just annoying. I really didn't like it. Now let's talk about the story, which is still told in a similar way to the previous games, where they use very minimal cutscenes, and Artyom is still a silent protagonist that you only hear in the loading screens as he sets up each chapter. And I found the narrative of this game to be the weakest in the series. While I think the premise is fantastic, of it like turning out that life does exist outside Moscow and you leave the metro and search for a new home, but in execution, it made a lot of the chapters feel episodic, where they made most of these stories contained within each chapter and had very little effect on the overall narrative of the game, with the exception of maybe like a member joining or leaving the crew. This game does completely drop the Dark One storyline, which was a major factor in the first two games, and really my favorite part of those first two games is narratives. But I mean, Last Light did kind of finish up that story, so I do understand why they're not involved in this game, but it did make this narrative a lot less interesting to me. The morality system from the previous games does return, but to be honest, I didn't pay attention to it. I didn't really in the previous games either, but I did end up getting the bad ending because of that, which I mean, I actually didn't mind as an ending, to be honest. I think the best possible ending would be like mixing portions of the good ending with the bad ending. I'm not saying that they were bad, just again, could have been better. Character-wise, you definitely get to know the characters a lot better in this game than the previous ones, where there are chapters in this game that are named after the respective season that take place in between the major chapters, and these are mostly just exploration sections on the train where you can interact and observe the members of the crew and steadily get to see their relationships progress. Finally, let's talk about the major chapters of the game. The opening in Moscow, it was a mostly linear section of the game and did a really good job at introducing the premise of the game, which, as I said, was a pretty strong concept. The Volga was the first open world section, and I didn't really care for it. It's actually what made me stop playing the game the first time I played it. I really thought this section really dragged on, and I didn't care for the new direction that the game was taking, so I initially stopped playing here until obviously I decided to make this video and decided to give the game another shot. But in retrospect, this is probably the open world chapter that brings the most to the table narratively. Yamantau was another linear level, which felt more in line with the previous games, where you're infiltrating a enemy base, and it was a much better level for it in my opinion. The Caspian was a massive desert open world, and I found this section kind of boring. And it involved a lot of driving that was pretty clunky due to there being a lot of cliffs that you would fall off of or have to find a way around. It also was just unimportant to the overall narrative. So I mean, overall, I really just didn't like this chapter. And I had similar issues with the Taiga as well, which was a jungle-like open world that you have to roam with very meager supplies and again, very little narrative progression. So for me, that dragged on as well. But for the final level in the Dead City, I really loved it. I love what they did narratively in this chapter. This was probably the most terrified I felt in the entire game. I mean, you were alone for a good chunk of it, and you were in underground tunnels and having to face or sneak around really strong enemies, which made it feel more in line with the previous Metro games. So for me, this is probably my favorite section of the entire game. So those are pretty much my thoughts on Metro Exodus. Again, I like this game as a whole, but I found it a bit underwhelming as a part of the Metro series due to its new game structure and its meandering story. In my reviews for the first two games, I gave Metro 2033 an 8 out of 10 and Last Light a 9 out of 10. I don't think this game is nearly to the caliber of Last Light, but I do think it's somewhat close to 2033, and I think because of that, I would give it a score of probably an 8 out of 10. So while I would consider this a minor misstep for the series as a whole, when a fourth Metro game comes out, which supposedly they are working on, I'm still interested in continuing on with the series, even though, again, gameplay-wise, it isn't exactly what I want. I do feel like narratively there could be some interesting stuff to come. So that is my review for Metro Exodus 1 year later. Thank you for watching.